1970, in a quiet suburb of Los Angeles, a harrowing story came to light. It would change forever our understanding of how a child's brain develops. A social worker discovered a 13-year-old girl who was still in diapers and whimpered like an animal.
Clearly something was terribly wrong. She didn't speak. She was completely unkempt. She could hardly walk. She could hardly balance.
Genie, as the child was named, had suffered a most horrific ordeal.
We learned after she was found from interviews with her mother, from some drawings that Genie made, that she had been kept isolated in a room at the back of a house. In this room there was a potty seat to which she had been harnessed without any clothes, just naked, and left to sit there day and night. She was in this room for 12 and a half years.
On November 4th, 1970, a frail girl and her mother quietly stepped into the social services office in Temple City, California. At first glance, the child looked no older than 6 or 7. Her walk was strange, unsteady, almost unnatural. She drooled constantly, sometimes spitting. She wore a diaper, and most unsettling of all, she didn't make a sound. The social worker watching her knew something was terribly wrong. But the truth was far worse than anyone could imagine. Because this girl wasn't 6, she was 13, and she wasn't autistic, deaf, or disabled.
I will see Mama Saturday! Right!
Yes, let's see you jump. Good. Can you jump some more? March. March.
Let me see. The log? You found a picture of a log. I didn't even know you knew what a log was. Where do you see a log?
She was the victim of one of the worst cases of abuse in human history.
Children have to belong to somebody when they grow up, and she was still a child, and she needed a family to belong to. So that's what we would have liked, a family that she could belong to. And that's not what happened, unfortunately. What did happen is about the worst outcome I think we would have envisioned.
Her name wasn't really Genie. That was just a pseudonym chosen by social workers to shield her identity from the press. But the name was hauntingly appropriate. Like a genie trapped inside a lamp, she had been locked away, silenced, and isolated for most of her life. And soon, the world would discover just how horrifying that captivity really was. The moment Genie was taken into custody, doctors examined her fragile body. What they found was devastating. She was severely malnourished. Her hips had become deformed. Her stomach was grotesquely distended from years of starvation. A thick, black callus stretched across her buttocks and thighs, a mark of endless hours spent tied to a potty chair. She was completely incontinent, and whenever someone tried to approach her, she recoiled, shying away from the simplest touch or eye contact. But why was she like this? At first, no one knew. Slowly, as investigators began questioning her mother, the terrifying truth began to surface. And it all started long before Genie was even born. Genie's parents were Irene and Clark Wiley. Clark was a jealous, controlling man. He was paranoid, overprotective, and violently abusive toward Irene. Every year of their marriage, Irene's freedom shrank more and more as Clark dictated what she could do, where she could go, and who she could see. And when children entered the picture, his cruelty only deepened. Despite Clark's objections, Irene became pregnant 5 years into the marriage. Late in the pregnancy, Clark beat her so viciously, she ended up in the hospital. It was there, bruised and broken, that Irene gave birth to a healthy baby girl. But back at home, life for that infant was anything but safe. Clark had an obsession with silence. He couldn't stand loud noises. The Wiley household was kept unnaturally quiet. Conversations whispered. The radio always turned to the lowest volume. So when the baby cried, Clark's anger erupted. At just 2 months old, the newborn was locked in an unheated garage for days. She developed pneumonia and didn't survive. Not long after, Irene became pregnant again. But this second child died shortly after birth from a blood disorder called Rh disease. Their third child, a boy named John Wiley, had a slightly different fate. He survived, but not without scars. By age 3, John still wasn't potty trained and struggled to walk, clear signs of neglect. It wasn't until Clark's own mother stepped in and took the boy into her care for several months that he began to recover. Even then, one thing was clear. Clark's cruelty was only growing. Clark Wiley was more devoted to his mother than to his own wife, and in return, his mother adored him completely. She spent countless hours in their home, doting on her son and even supporting the family financially whenever Clark was out of work.
Mr. Wiley?
Yes.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charges. We haven't even seen them.
To Irene, her presence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. The favoritism, the interference, the way Clark seemed to listen to his mother above all else. It was a constant source of tension. But that fragile balance was about to collapse. In April 1957, Genie was born. At first, her life didn't appear drastically different from that of her older brother. She likely endured neglect, but for the first 20 months, she seemed to survive without anything unusual happening. There was still a sliver of normalcy. Then, in December 1958, tragedy struck. Clark's mother, the one anchor holding the family together, was killed in a car accident by a drunk driver. For Clark, this was more than just grief. It was the breaking point. Already violent, controlling, and unstable, Clark now plunged into paranoia. He convinced himself that the world outside was dangerous, that evil forces lurked everywhere, and that he had to protect his family at any cost. And so, his descent into madness began. Clark moved his wife and children into his late mother's house. It had just 2 bedrooms. One of them, his mother's, was left untouched, a shrine to her memory. No one was allowed to enter it. The other bedroom, however, would become Genie's prison. As for the rest of the family, they confined themselves to the living room. At night, young John slept on a small pallet on the floor, while Clark and Irene slept in armchairs. Clark often sat with a revolver in his lap, convinced that intruders were coming for them. At first, Genie was sometimes placed outside in a playpen or allowed to play in the yard. But according to Irene, even then she would claw at the playpen with her fingernails until it broke apart. How long must she have been left alone, forgotten, to reach that point? It was only the beginning. Clark's paranoia intensified with each passing week. Genie's time outside the bedroom grew shorter and shorter, until one day it stopped altogether. She was no longer allowed out of that small room. She wasn't even 2 years old, and already her world had been reduced to 4 bare walls. But the true horror wasn't just her confinement, it was how she was restrained inside. The room contained only 3 pieces of furniture: a cupboard, a cot, and a potty chair. Clark had built a special harness for that chair, strapping Genie into it naked during the day. The straps kept her arms and legs pinned down, supposedly to prevent her from touching her own waist. Her cot was no refuge either. It was a cage. A wire mesh covered the sides and the top, trapping her inside. A sleeping bag was tightened so firmly around her body that her arms were immobilized at her sides. If she was fortunate, she was placed in this cot at night. But more often than not, she was left strapped to the potty chair until morning. The walls around her were bare. the curtains drawn, the door always shut. A child, barely a toddler, abandoned in silence and darkness, with no way out. Inside that dark room, even Irene was discouraged from interacting with her own daughter. The only real attention Genie received came in the form of Clark's violence. In one corner of the room, he kept a large stick, reserved solely for punishing her whenever she dared make a sound. For Genie, silence wasn't just survival, it was the only option. When she was fed at all, it was done with cruelty. Meals were never about nourishment or care. She was given nothing more than mush.
Genie's parents were both charged with willful abuse. 15 minutes before he was due in court, her father put a gun to his head.
Baby food, soggy cereal, tasteless slop shoved into her mouth as fast as possible. If she choked or spat any of it out, the mess wasn't cleaned. It was rubbed into her face as punishment. And this was her world. Starved, alone, strapped to a potty chair. For days, months, years. From the age of 2 until 13, Genie lived in total isolation. She stared endlessly at the same blank walls, her body slowly deforming under the restraints that bound her. According to Susan Curtis's book, Genie, a psycholinguistic study of a modern-day wild child, there were even darker abuses. Details so horrific they've never been made public. What could be worse than what we already know? The mind almost refuses to imagine it. Think about your own childhood, everything you learned, every memory you built between the ages of 2 and 13. Now imagine living those years in silence, in darkness, in chains. That was Genie's reality. During this time, Irene's own health collapsed. She went almost completely blind. Even if she had wanted to intervene, she was powerless. Until one day, something changed. In October 1970, Genie was 13 years old and still bound to her potty chair. After a violent argument with Clark, Irene finally reached her breaking point. She threatened to leave unless he allowed her to call her parents, a chilling reminder of just how much control Clark had over every aspect of her life. Surprisingly, Clark relented. He let her make the call. And that call would set everything into motion. Later that day, while Clark was away, Irene made her choice. She freed Genie from her restraints. Together, mother and daughter walked out of that prison-like home and went to live with Irene's parents. 3 weeks later, Irene brought Genie to the social services office, and for the first time, someone outside the family truly saw what had been done to her. Her condition shocked everyone. Genie had hardly ever worn clothes, so she didn't seem to notice heat or cold. She had never eaten solid food. She didn't know how to chew and struggled even to swallow. After years strapped to a potty chair, her body was twisted. She couldn't stand upright, couldn't straighten her arms or legs, couldn't run, hop, jump, or climb. Even walking was a painful shuffle, her feet dragging as her body swayed from side to side. Her vision told another story of her captivity. Having never seen beyond the 10 feet between her potty chair and the bedroom door, her eyes had become nearsighted to that exact distance. Her voice, or rather, her silence, was even more haunting. Beaten for making sounds, Genie had learned to suppress almost every noise. She never cried in pain. She never laughed when she was happy. She lived in near-complete silence. Physically, she weighed only 59 pounds and stood just 54 inches tall. Her hair was thin and stringy. She drooled constantly, spitting on whatever was nearby. She was incontinent, unsocialized, primitive, stripped of everything that made her human. Even the way she walked was disturbing. Observers called it her bunny walk, a posture that looked as though she was still strapped to the potty chair, her body permanently molded by years of confinement. In time, Genie did begin to imitate some words from her caretakers, but even then, Her speech was haunting. Each word came in a strange, high-pitched, breathy tone, blurted out quickly, as though she was terrified that making too much noise would bring punishment. Her body carried the scars of abuse. Her voice carried the memory of fear. And her silence spoke louder than words ever could.
Jump. Let's see you jump.
There was also something deeply unusual about Genie's responses to the world around her. Caretakers noticed that if she was given a simple instruction, say, to pick something up, she wouldn't respond right away. But sometimes, 10 minutes later, she would suddenly obey the command as if it had just been spoken. It was as though the endless monotony of her isolation had warped her very sense of time. Genie's lack of speech made her particularly fascinating to researchers in the field of linguistics. You see, science has often crossed unsettling boundaries in its quest to understand how the mind develops. In one infamous experiment, kittens were raised inside a drum where they could only see horizontal lines. When released, they lost the ability to perceive vertical ones, stumbling helplessly into chair legs they could no longer recognize. Then there was the infamous wire mother experiment, which revealed that young rhesus monkeys preferred the comfort of a soft, cloth-covered mother over a wire one that provided milk. It was proof that love and touch were more important than food itself. But it also showed the devastating effects of social isolation. These experiments were always done on animals, because to deliberately subject a human child to such conditions, that would be unthinkable. And yet, Genie existed. Her parents had done what no scientist ever could. They had created a living experiment in isolation. And that is why researchers would later refer to her case as the forbidden experiment. To psychologists, neurologists, and linguists, Genie represented an opportunity that was both horrifying and irresistible. They rushed to her, desperate to study her, each hoping to uncover secrets about the human brain, about language, about development itself. It would be easy to see what came next as pure exploitation, scientists circling a tragedy like vultures around a dying body. And in some ways, that image isn't wrong. But the truth is more complicated. Over the following years, Genie was moved between multiple foster homes, each one experimenting with their own ideas of how best to rehabilitate her. She was subjected to constant tests, endless evaluations. Yet, at the same time, many of the people studying her seemed to genuinely care. They weren't only chasing data, they were also trying, in their own ways, to help her heal. Still, what unfolded often felt less like therapy and more like a tug-of-war between competing egos, with Genie caught helplessly in the middle. For those wanting to explore this period in detail, Russ Reimer's book, Genie, A Scientific Tragedy, lays out the conflicts, politics, and personal rivalries among the researchers. But here, the focus remains on Genie herself, the girl behind the studies, the child behind the headlines, and the reports from those who worked with her paint a haunting picture. One researcher recalled visiting her during breakfast. Genie sat at a table with two other children who were laughing and chatting in the way kids naturally do. But Genie didn't join them. She didn't laugh, didn't speak, didn't play. Genie carried with her a series of unsettling mannerisms, habits that revealed just how much her years of isolation had robbed her of a normal childhood. She often drooled excessively, letting saliva drip and splatter onto anything within reach, her own body, her clothes, even onto those sitting nearby. The constant dampness left her with a sour, unpleasant odor that clung to her everywhere she went. Mealtimes were no easier. Genie had never been introduced to solid foods before, so she didn't know how to chew. When given food, she would cram her mouth full, cheeks bulging like a chipmunk hiding away nuts, and simply wait until her saliva softened it enough to swallow. The sight was difficult for others to watch, and it was just one more reminder of the childhood she had been denied. But it didn't stop there. During meals, Genie often got up from her seat and wandered around the dining room, stopping at other children's places. She would reach toward their plates, trying to take the foods she liked best: applesauce, milk, ice cream. Sometimes, with her mouth already stuffed with half-chewed food, she would spit some of it out onto another child's plate. Maybe, in her own strange way, she thought she was offering a trade, giving something of hers in return for what she was about to take. But no one welcomed this kind of gesture. For everyone else, eating with Genie was rarely a pleasant experience. Yet beneath these troubling behaviors, there was another side to her, one that was impossible to ignore. For the first time in her life, Genie was free from her prison, and her curiosity about the world was insatiable. She wanted to know everything. Though she couldn't form full words, she would eagerly point at objects around her, eyes wide with wonder, insisting on learning their names. Slowly, she began to mimic those sounds, one word at a time.
Spoon is for.
Water? Can you get a glass of water? You can.
By 1971, Genie had taken her first steps into language. She could now use single words to express what she wanted, simple, fragile sparks of communication after years of silence. Just a year later, her progress continued. She began stringing two words together, building small bridges between thought and speech. And by the following year, those bridges grew stronger. Genie was forming phrases of 3 words or more, proof that despite everything she had endured, her mind was still reaching for connection. Each new phrase carried with it a haunting question. How far could she go if given the chance?
I will see Mama Saturday! Right!
Sometimes, instead of words, Genie relied on gestures, using her hands and body to create more detailed sentences when language failed her. For a while, there was hope. Maybe, just maybe, she would eventually learn to speak fluently. But then, she seemed to hit a wall. Her progress slowed, and no matter how hard she tried, the leap into full language felt just out of reach. You see, memorizing words is only part of communication. To truly master language, you need the hidden rules and structures we all use without ever thinking about them. And yet, we somehow just know them. Take this example, described in Russ Reimer's book. The sentence, "I gave the book to John," can be flipped to, "I gave John the book," and both sound perfectly fine. But if we change the verb, the rhythm breaks. "I donated the book to John" works, but "I donated John the book" feels strange and unnatural. Why? Because gave comes from Anglo-Saxon roots, while donated comes from Latin. And without ever studying this rule, our brains instinctively know the difference. That's just one of countless rules we all absorb effortlessly as children. But Genie never got that chance. According to linguist Eric Lenneberg, the natural acquisition of a first language happens only during a critical period, a window that begins around age 2 and closes by puberty. Tragically, those were the exact years Genie spent locked away in silence and isolation. No matter how much her caretakers tried, the truth was devastating. Genie would never acquire a full, natural language. And when you listen to her attempts at speech, the heartbreaking gaps in her understanding become painfully clear.
Let me see. The log?
He likes her.
When Genie spoke, her words didn't always mean what they seemed. She would often say things like, "I like log," or "I like Davy." But this didn't necessarily mean she liked those things. What she really might have been trying to say was, "This is a log," or "I saw Davy," or even, "I can draw a circle." For Genie, the phrase "I like" was simply a tool, a way to start a sentence. She didn't yet understand how those words connected to what came next. Still, despite her struggles with language, there were times she revealed chilling fragments of her past, and those moments showed just how deeply her trauma still haunted her. She would say things like, "Father hit big stick," or "Father hit Genie big stick." Sometimes even, "Father take piecewood, hit cry." Each broken phrase carried a weight far heavier than words, glimpses into the nightmare she had lived through. But her trauma wasn't only in her words, it showed in her behavior too. Genie had an unusual obsession with plastic containers, things like Tupperware, buckets, even beakers. She would collect and hoard them wherever she stayed. Later, her mother revealed why. On the rare occasions when Genie was strapped to her potty chair, she was sometimes given an empty cottage cheese container as her only toy. And then there was her fear. Genie was absolutely terrified of dogs, so much so that if she saw one, even a harmless puppy, she would bolt into traffic just to escape. At first, no one understood why, but soon the truth came out. When she was a child, her father would stand outside her bedroom door and make growling noises, like a vicious dog, just to keep her silent. Some reports even suggest he grew his nails unnaturally long so he could scratch her face. But what about Clark Wiley, the man responsible for so much of her suffering? What punishment did he face for what he had done? The answer is almost unthinkable. Just 1 month after Genie was rescued, before he could even stand trial, Clark took his own life. He shot himself, leaving behind a short, chilling note. It read, "The world will never understand."
You want to see your father? Father is not living.
Genie's story doesn't have the kind of ending we hope for. By the time she reached 18, she had been making real progress, slowly but surely finding her place in the world. But then, everything changed. Genie was moved back in with her mother, back to the very house where she had once been imprisoned in silence and darkness. It didn't last long. Irene Wiley soon realized that her daughter's behavioral challenges were more than she could handle. Desperate, she turned to the California Department of Health, and just like that, Genie was placed into care once again. But this time, the homes were nothing like the supportive families she'd once known. Instead, they were strict foster homes, places where Genie endured vicious verbal and physical abuse. The fragile progress she had made over the past 5 years began to unravel. Slowly, painfully, Genie regressed. Russ Reimer's book recalls a haunting moment with psychologist Jay Shirley, who showed him a box of photographs of Genie. The final 2 pictures didn't even look like her. At first, Reimer thought they were of a stranger. One photo showed a large, disoriented woman sitting in a car, pretending to drive, her front teeth protruding in a strained grin. The other showed her indoors at a birthday party, struggling to focus on the cake. Before her, her hair had been hacked off unevenly across her forehead, leaving her looking less like a young woman and more like a patient in an asylum. That was her 27th birthday, Shirley explained grimly. I was there, and I saw her again at 29. She still looked miserable, like someone chronically institutionalized. He paused, his eyes heavy. This is soul sickness, he said. There was no medical explanation for what had happened to Genie, only the crushing weight of years lost and the wounds of a life that had never healed. The last known update on Genie came from The Guardian in 2011. It reported that, 4 decades after her rescue, she remained in state care. Attempts to learn more were denied. If Genie is still alive today, her whereabouts and condition remain shrouded in silence. And so, we're left with one of the last traces she gave the world, a simple drawing from 1977, 2 years after she was sent back into care. The labels were written by someone else, but the words were Genie's own. "I miss Mama, Mama's hand, baby Genie." Was it a memory? Or a wish for a childhood she never truly had?
You remember what it was like when you lived at home? What were you sitting on when you ate the cereal?
In the pot.
In the potty chair.
Potty.
Where did you stay when you lived at home? Where did you live? Where did you sleep?
Pot.
You slept in the potty chair?
Thank you so much for watching this story. I truly hope it gave you something to think about. And a special thank you to everyone who continues to support my work. Your support means more than words can say. Until we meet again in the next video, take care. Goodbye.